Good morning, everyone. Allow me to introduce today's presenter for our BBT session, Gabi. Gabi is a PhD student enrolled in Lancaster University's Higher Education Evaluation and Enhancement Program. And her provisional working title for her thesis is Factors that Enable and Constrain Engagement in Online Higher Education by Refugees and Asylum Seekers. And she's using two conceptual frameworks, an online engagement framework and the capability approach. So Gabi will have 30 minutes to present. She's not using any slides. And then after that, Faith will be the discussant, and then we'll have a round of question and answer. If I may please ask all of you to switch off your mics, please. Over to you, Gabi.
Thank you very much, Moffat, and thank you to all of you for inviting me. I feel very honoured to be here today. I've been following your work for quite some time and have been very inspired by it. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me to be talking with all of you today. I wasn't planning to present for 30 minutes at all. I was planning to give a very brief overview of the work I've been doing on my open thesis, and then hand over to Faith to fire questions at me or responses, and then just open it up for question and answer and informal discussion. So the topic that I'm going to be talking to you about is the idea of an open thesis. I don't have a great deal to tell you yet about my actual thesis because it's still quite early days in terms of what I've, what I've actually produced so far. So as Moffat said in his introduction to me, I'm on the PhD program through Lancaster University that I think some of you might be familiar with through your association with Melis Jin. And perhaps others, Paul Ashwin and others at Lancaster University. And basically, it's a slightly unusual PhD program in that the first half is module-based. So we did a whole bunch of modules in the first 2 years where we had to produce 3 publishable pieces. And I did complete those and got them published, which I'm really happy about. But they're not actually part of the thesis. And then the thesis itself is a lot shorter probably than the thesis that most of you are familiar with. It's only 45,000 words, but it still seems like a lot to me. And yeah, I could choose whether or not to link all these pieces together or not, but in reality, only some of them are linked. Throughout the process, I've had a focus on refugees and online higher education because I've been living in the UK since 2009. And in 2015, there was this massive movement of refugees into Europe that was really big news at the time. And to me, it seemed kind of obvious that a lot of them would be wanting to do higher education, would have had their studies interrupted, or would have previously completed a degree in their home country, but not been able to bring their transcripts with them, or maybe the university no longer exists and can't verify it, or maybe it's just not recognized in their new home country. And I'm a big enthusiast of online learning, since I did a master's degree myself through a university in Australia, USQ. That was from 2005 to 2009, without ever setting foot in Australia. And even in those days, it was possible to do fantastic online learning. And I discovered the joys of, like I am today, talking with people, working with people across the world, using digital technologies to facilitate that. and working on projects, things where, you know, creating an educational website with someone in a different country, and they'd be working through the night for me, and then I'd wake up in the morning and kind of carry on where they left off. So that's my enthusiasm. And I thought, well, you know, and it wasn't only the, you know, sort of the Syrian refugees coming to Europe, but it was the knowledge of migrants and people on the move all around the world. And generally people in disadvantaged circumstances who live far away from a city with a lovely university where they can be on campus, and who perhaps have to work, and for all kinds of reasons that have become much more visible to the whole world during transparent during the pandemic, could benefit from flexible ways of learning in higher education. So I started looking into this a few years ago, and there is an organization that was established in Germany called Chiron, K-I-R-O-N, and they're a non-governmental, non-profit organization that started offering free online courses to refugees. They're still running and they're doing brilliant work. And I joined as a kind of a study buddy for a few of their refugees, having Skype calls and stuff with them. But I could see that the idea in theory was a lot easier than in practice. There are so many practical issues, as I'm sure you've all been working through on the ground, when students are required to learn online, not just the technical stuff of do they have the equipment, do they have the broadband, do they have the access, but beyond that there are digital skills needed, digital literacies, and whole new ways of learning and working, which you can't assume people bring with them. So, and then on top of that, all the usual kind of cultural issues about having a university that is steeped in Western traditions of academia, that doesn't necessarily respect the learning tradition that a student from a completely different country and cultural background is coming from. So all these things come together. So I started out my thesis thinking I want to focus on engagement. I don't know if it's been the same in South Africa in the last 10 years, but in the UK, there's been a big focus in the higher education literature on student engagement, and it means different things to different people. But basically, it's about how students focus, how they stay engaged. They don't drop out. They stick through to the end of the program. They do what's expected of them by the university. So I found a nice framework that's really nice to work with. It's by Redmond et al. 2018. It's on my, I think it's on my bio or my abstract that you've been sent. And it was based on a literature review into student engagement that shows that there are these 5 categories of engagement that have been identified in the empirical research. There's cognitive engagement, which is kind of, you take that for granted that people are going to engage intellectually. There's behavioral engagement, which means people, they come to class, they do their assignments, they sit in exams, they do they tick all the boxes that's required of them. There's emotional engagement, which doesn't always immediately come to mind, but we know from all the capability literature as well that that's really significant, and that can be a conversion factor. There is social engagement, which online is really important, and people who've been doing online education, perhaps UNISA in the last few years, the Open University in the UK for many years, they recognise this need for social engagement. You can't just send students stuff, to work with intellectually and expect them to get on with it without recognising that there's quite a strong need for social engagement, which creates a sense of belonging and builds your sense of identity as a student and all that. And then finally, a 5th one, which I was quite surprised at that they came up with, was collaborative engagement. And that takes social engagement one step further. And it's engagement around the learning. So it's when students do a group project together. As peers, they co-construct knowledge. Or when students work with, maybe they go on an employment placement and they do something with other people, other professionals at work, or they go to the library and work with a librarian to achieve something. So these 5 categories of engagement, initially I was just going to do a thesis saying, well, I'll interview some refugees who are doing distance learning. I will analyze the data using these 5 categories, but something was really bothering me all along, and that came from the research I'd previously done with these refugee students, the Chiron refugee students that I wrote a paper about a few years ago. And that was the major role that agency played in overcoming, personal agency and hard work and just creativity and finding ways to overcome obstacles. And that balanced against structural factors that made it often very difficult and occasionally impossible for a person to complete their studies or to fully engage. So that for me was missing in the mainstream engagement literature, and I wanted to bring it in somewhere. And then I stumbled across the capability approach. Actually, initially through going to a session, I was very fortunate to be able to go to a presentation that Melanie Walker gave in London at the SARChI-HEHD some years ago. And that kind of blew my mind. It was the first thing I'd ever heard about capabilities. I had knowledge from a long time ago about Amartya Sen, and I knew that he had won this Nobel Prize and everything, but that was my introduction to it. And I kind of put it on the back burner for a while, and then I went back to it when I was trying to fill this agency gap. And I thought, this is exactly where I need to be looking. And then I got very excited because I discovered that this team in the Free State was kind of the thought leaders in this whole area. And so the whole idea of it being led from the global south made an impression on me as well, because that's not the traditional way that things happen in research in the kind of world that I was in at the time. So I started reading all this stuff and trying to make sense of it, and that's the background to my thesis. That's more information than I was going to give you about the background, but what it did for me, okay, I'll just bring this full circle back to what I was doing some decades ago in South Africa when I was living and working in South Africa in the 80s and 90s. After I finished my degree at Wits, I majored in Zulu language and social anthropology, and I wanted to work in linguistics and sort of some kind of teaching role. So I worked in the NGO sector in adult literacy teaching, and at the time there were an estimated 15 million illiterate adults in South Africa. It was an absolute crime and a scandal that people had been deliberately prevented from going to school. So as adults, they were unable to do more than put a cross on a form at the post office where they had their savings account, stuff like that. And they were so vulnerable to being abused and exploited. So for many years, that was the sector I worked in. I got introduced to higher education through SARChI-HEHD, the South African Institute for Distance Education, which some of you might be familiar with, or all of you, I guess. And I started working with them on stuff around online education when I myself learned about online education. So I came back into higher education after that. So then the idea of the open thesis, I brought in this stuff about my background in adult literacy, because the whole impetus there was to increase opportunities for people who had been denied opportunities for an education. So that was basic education, but it's the same principle, higher education, whichever level you're looking at. And when I came to the UK, I was working initially at the University of Leicester, where they had funding to do projects around open education. So that brought me full circle back to the whole idea of, oh, wow, we've got digital technologies now that enable us to increase people's access to education and to knowledge and to resources. And all the stuff about Paulo Freire that we'd been steeped in the 1980s was like, how can we use this stuff that's actually been developed in a very commercial environment? You know, the laptops we're using today, the phones, the platforms, they were all initially developed for entertainment and business purposes. They were not, they were then kind of adjusted to be used for education. So it was thinking, how can we use these to empower people and to, you know, enable a greater sharing and a more equal sharing of knowledge and so on. So when I started doing my thesis, it was actually quite hard to find a case study where I could get access to refugees. The refugees I'd had access to through this organization in Germany were by that stage completing their online programs and moving on. And then I came across this project at my local university where I was a previous employee, Leicester University, the SARChI Scholarship Programme. And SARChI Scholarship Programmes are quite common in UK universities. And basically they offer free tuition to refugees and asylum seekers. But the way they've always been managed in the past is, and still today mostly, is that you have to be a refugee or an asylum seeker in the city within travelling distance of that university, because you don't necessarily get any extra money to cover your travel costs or your living costs or anything. So I was thinking to myself, why isn't this happening online? And then I discovered this program through Leicester University that is happening online. So I got to know the person, the director of this program, and she agreed. She was very excited when I said I'd like to do my thesis focusing on how your students are engaging in it's a master's program in international relations and politics and international relations. So for my case study, I have 9 refugees and asylum seekers. One of them is located in a refugee camp in Malawi. One is a Somali guy who has relocated to Malaysia. So they're all over the place. Some of them are even located in Leicester. There's one in the United States. And I've done my data gathering via WhatsApp, Skype, Zoom, whichever platforms they wanted to use. And in the process, I wanted to do my thesis openly. And the reason for doing my thesis openly was because I'm engaging with NGOs now and charities and other higher education institutions that are trying to support and enable refugees and asylum seekers and migrants, you know, locally, people who are, what's the word, IDPs, internally displaced persons as well. So I wanted to be making my learning, sharing my learning openly for several reasons. One is that it enabled me then to engage with dialogue with other people who are interested. So I'm using Twitter a lot, I'm using my blog, I've set up a Google site and so on. I speak at conferences, I jumped at the opportunity to speak with you guys, all for the same reasons. And then it also enables me to get feedback from people as I'm going, so I can constantly be kept up to date if there's a new paper out or somebody is doing something interesting that I can bring in. But also it just enables me to share stuff, because so much of the literature that we read and we depend on to enable, to further and advance our own research is locked behind paywalls. So by writing stuff that is under an open license, I'm using a Creative Commons license, I can't, copy and paste straight from what people have written, apart from the usual kind of citation protocols that we have in academia anyway. But that is a way of getting the thinking out and, stimulating the dialogue. So I thought I would write chapter by chapter. I was quite sort of ambitious. I thought it would be a chapter a month. I am working half-time as well at the University of Birmingham. So I can't work on this full-time. And I thought, yeah, it's a short thesis, I can do that. But once I started reading the stuff on capabilities, I got very excited about it. And I couldn't do a superficial job of it because I found it more complicated than at first reading. At first reading, it seems like, the concepts are relatively understandable and you can start applying them. But actually, when you start reading what all the different people are writing, you see people using terminology in different ways. You see different emphases, and there's just so much to learn. So I wanted to do it as well as I possibly could. So I've spent the last, probably since May, I've been writing this series of blog posts on the capability approach. And I started with Sen and Nussbaum, and then I started reading the stuff that many of you have written and others in that area. So I've written 10 posts now. The last one I posted yesterday. If any of you looked at my blog link a week ago, you would have missed the last one. I'm using a framework from Elaine Unterhalter, equity from above, equity from below, and equity from the middle. So it's kind of looking at capabilities from a top-down perspective, a bottom-up perspective. And so top-down is how national governments and regional governments are handling, are kind of contributing to furthering or not furthering people's capabilities in higher education. Bottom up is looking at things like aspirations and agency of students in higher education, particularly students coming from disadvantage as defined by Wolf and de Charlotte. And then the middle layer is where people in, institutions, academic staff, departments and so on, devise curricula and support programs and widening participation programs and stuff. So that post I hope will come out this weekend, but I've got a lot of work to do on that still. And then I'll do a final summarizing post where I say why this is relevant to my thesis. And then I will move on to looking at student engagement, and I'm narrowing that literature down to wherever I can find stuff about student engagement in online higher education, especially in cases of disadvantage, or in cases where learners are mobile or migrants. There's not really very much directly in the area that I'm trying to research. So that's where I'm at. I've discovered, I've encountered some issues. Perhaps the issue that I had the most difficulty with was an ethical issue that I blogged about. Some of you might have seen that blog post, where alongside my decision to write this thesis openly, I made a separate decision, also in principle, that I wanted my research participants to be named, to have the option to be named. And I wanted that to be made very upfront to them, so that I didn't just go in saying, okay, don't worry, you will be anonymous. Everything you say will be anonymous, because some people want to be acknowledged, and why not? I'm depending on them for my research, and it's good academic practice in every other context. These are master's students. They're not, they're people who can certainly make a very reasoned judgment as to whether they want to be named or not. But then you combine that with the fact that I'm blogging as I go along, so stuff is coming out, could be coming out fairly soon after I've interviewed someone. I needed to kind of mesh those two things, and of my 9 participants, 7 of them said, yes, I want to be named. At the time that they filled in the consent form, one of them said, no, I want to be anonymous. And one said, I want to see what you write. And that one person, I thought, yeah, that person knows what they're doing, because they gave me carte blanche, right, to write whatever in my judgment, I thought was right. And I thought that was very generous of them, but at the same time, a bit unpredictable as to what was going to come out from my research. So I came to a solution where I would I would show everything to them before making it public, and I would only use their name if they gave me explicit permission to use their name. And then some of them agreed further to have a blog post written on a separate blog called refugeelearningstories.org, where I made a summary of their personal statement for their SARChI scholarship application, because as part of my interviews through my ethical approval process, I had committed to not asking them any questions at all about their background, how they came to be where they are, about anything that might re-trigger trauma. So I read quite a bit about the ethics of interviewing people who have probably experienced trauma. And that was a very clear thing that I committed to. But then some of them gave me permission to read their personal statements, and their personal statements included stories which didn't explicitly go into detail about trauma, but certainly, you know, on some level hinted at it or described it. So that was that came up as something that I needed to take extra care over and have extra communication with my research participants about. So that's where I'm at the moment. As soon as I've finished the series of blog posts I'm going to write on student engagement, I'm going to go to my data, which I'm itching to get my hands on. It's sitting in my NVivo waiting to be analysed. But then I'll have categories. I feel so much clearer now about what I'm looking for in terms of the capability approach. Certainly agency, aspirations, conversion factors. You know, I've got terminology, and I think I will recognize those things when I see them in capability terms. And I've had a lot of positive feedback from people about the way I'm doing it, you know, the stuff I'm sharing. So that's been really helpful. And then I'll have the 5 categories of engagement, and then I'll see what else comes up. So I promised not to talk for long, and I broke my promise. I apologize for that. I will stop now and hand over back to you guys.
Thank you, Gabi, for the insightful presentation and the categories of engagement that you're going to use also to analyze your data. That was very insightful. I will hand over to Faith, who's our discussant.
Thank you. I'm just switching on my camera. Okay. On. Well, thanks, Moffat, and thanks a lot, Gabi, for that presentation. I think it's different, it's insightful, it's very creative, and I think it's very ambitious again. I'll speak to a couple of things. I had the chance to look at the work that you're doing. I went to your blog, I tracked your progress, which I found to be very interesting. The first thing that I'll speak to is obviously your work on refugees, because this is something that I'm interested in, and it's what your research is all about. And I think there is no better time to do research on online learning but this. And of course, because of what has been happening in the past year, this kind of research is relevant to all higher education institutions and all their diverse student populations. But for me, more so for refugees, because there are already fears by both higher education experts and the UNHCR that without support for university education of refugees, their countless futures will be jeopardized because of COVID-19. And obviously, generally, there is not a lot of refugees who are in higher education, so such fears for me are valid. And I came across a June UNHCR report showing that COVID-19 had put about the world's 71 million refugees and FDPs, as you mentioned, in a major crisis. The closure of universities, technical and vocational colleges, and all the other institutions that refugees have access to had affected the refugee students. And there is a risk that the progress that had been made to date in terms of increased enrollments may be eroded. And remember, here we're speaking about increased enrollment rates of refugees, but generally these are very low numbers. And so your work for me speaks to these concerns already raised by the institutions that work with refugees. So while COVID responses have revealed a critical digital divide, the kind of work that you're doing in a way provides a sneak peek of what could be the possibilities in thinking about supporting continuous or alternative learning approaches. And this in context where refugees or other marginalized groups have access to those platforms. And I'm glad to hear that the refugees that you're working with in Malawi and in different parts of the world. That's very encouraging. I was glad to hear that refugees in other parts of Africa actually do have access to those platforms. And again, I think this work is very important because unless this kind of work is done, each of us want to know the roles that we can play to make a difference. And this includes like the NGOs that you're already working with and governments. And now going to you choosing to make your work open thesis, I think it's definitely fitting for the kind of study that you're doing. Like I said earlier, I liked the fact that I could go online and track your progress, look at what you're doing. And I felt at some point, I felt like I was invading your privacy. But I mean, such an open research practice is in line with what we all as researchers, teachers, lecturers, or whatever we are through our different work are advocating for. I mean, expanding collaborative, inclusive, accessible, and active education and research practices. I mean, for most of us, again, this also builds on the philosophical underpinnings of the CA that speaks about the freedom that we have to access such opportunities to engage for us in the work that we're doing. And you mentioned, I think you mentioned a couple of things in terms of the benefits of using this online open platform rather. And I think what you mentioned is very convincing for me. The data gathered can be further, I think somewhere I read that you said it can be mined by other scholars, which for me embraces a research practice that's built around collaborative creation of knowledge between researchers and also between researchers and participants. It also supports the open sharing of research ideas and practices that encourages us as researchers to tap into and benefit from ideas of fellow researchers, which I think is really missing for now, that kind of peer-to-peer learning platform. And you spoke about the NGOs that you're working with, and you mentioned that it enables them to learn, I guess, from the research and also engage you in dialogue while you're working, while you're still working on the project. Again, for me, a collaborative exercise, and in this instance, bringing higher education and its stakeholders, NGOs, into conversation. And I thought if participants have access to this kind of platform, I think I'll have to ask you here, because I was not sure when you're speaking if the refugees can actually, like I did, I could go to the Google Doc and I saw that I could actually make changes. I'm not sure if the refugees that you're working with at this stage can go to the platform and make changes and suggest things. And if they do, if they're able to do that, are those changes visible to all of us, or they're only visible to you? That's what I was thinking about when you were presenting. And just to move on to what I was thinking, what I reflected on. The research, again, is, you mentioned that it's available to interested readers who may not have access to the paywall databases. It addresses the element of accessibility, which for me is something that's going to continue for a long time. That will remain as one of the key conversations in relation to access to higher education as institutions, right? And then access to the processes and the practices that happen within those institutions. And I thought that that was kind of a nice thing for participants or students to be involved in. And I think beyond making the whole project accessible to the communities that you're working with, I would imagine that this kind of approach is also useful to you as a researcher because, like I said, readers are able to leave suggestions, questions, which may help strengthen your work, but also in terms of your own thought process, reflecting on this exercise and what you're doing. I guess that's what I noted when you were talking, and obviously my looking at your work prior. I have a list of questions that I would like to ask, but I guess for now I would ask one or two and leave it open to the floor. If there's nothing that's picked up, we can discuss that later, or we can take on the conversation to Twitter or wherever we engage. I think the first question that I would love to ask is, beyond the ethical issues that you highlighted in the presentation, could you perhaps speak about any other challenges you have experienced in this process so far? I mean, when I was reading, I was like, I would love to do something like this, but I was thinking, okay, but what are the challenges that I may not be aware of? So if someone is interested in adopting something like this, what would be your advice to them? And I think the other thing that I was thinking about is, what are the publication implications of this work, right? I know you have published 3 papers before this, and now you're busy with other data. What are the implications when you want to publish this data? Because as far as I know, you already have a Creative Commons license. How would that work if you decide to publish in a different journal or something like that? And what would you say about this thought that I had? Having open dissertation or open thesis as a form of storytelling, because I was thinking, okay, this captures the experiences of you as a researcher, and so it perhaps could be a form of storing your experiences. But I was not sure what you think about that. I think I will leave it there for now. I'll share the other questions later. But again, I think the final comment, this is just a thought, not a question. I understand that you're restricted to 45,000 words, and I know that Lancaster is very strict to sticking to 45,000 words. So depending on your plan to develop this kind of work beyond your PhD, maybe, I thought there were multiple dimensions of analysis that you could think about, especially from a CA perspective. The first level of analysis is obviously your current data that you're gathering from the refugees through interviews. Is it photo voice? Did you mention photo voice? I can't remember. But I also thought that analyzing your work, the use of open thesis from a CA perspective, and the kinds of opportunities this approach expands in terms of like helping maybe researchers or other people who are in a similar field, that could be interesting from a CA perspective. Otherwise, congratulations. I think it's a job well done so far. I'm learning every day, and this has definitely been an interesting one for me. Thanks, Mofat.
Thank you very much for the discussion and the comments that you raised, and also the questions. Perhaps, Gabi, would you want to address the comments and also the questions that Faith raised, and then we can get into the question and answer segment. For those with questions, you can also then type in your questions. Thank you. Okay,
great. Thank you so much, Faith and Moffat. That was very encouraging feedback to get from you, especially seeing as I've got Mkwananzi in brackets so many times throughout my blog posts. I learned a lot from your book. So in terms of your questions, can the refugees themselves who I've been interviewing, can they access and comment on my documents? Yes, they can. And my hope was that because they are master's students in a program on politics and international relations, some of them are doing a module on human rights, which includes mention of the capability approach. So I thought there's a small chance that one or two of them might even have engaged with this approach and be interested to discuss it with me, sort of in an academic way. As yet, none of them have. They've all shown enthusiasm about being given access, and they've got exactly the same access that you've got, that everybody's got, to write comments on my Google Docs and so on, or my blog posts. They haven't yet. Some of them have given me some private feedback, but it's more related to what I've written specifically about them. So it's still early days, and I'm hoping there might be more opportunities for that, bearing in mind that they are also busy with a master's program, which is very demanding on their time. Some of them are working full time, or in difficult circumstances where they're relocating and stuff, so to different countries. So it is, I don't want to, that might be answering one of your other questions, Faith, about other challenges. One of the challenges is that I don't want to place too many demands on my research participants. That's why I didn't go for a more participatory approach. And I did initially think of doing photo voice with them. And I actually invited them to send me photos, but that didn't yield a great deal, apart from some interesting pictures that they sent me via WhatsApp that I probably won't use unless they specifically give me permission to use them. But it gave me insight into their personal environments, their study environments and stuff. But I didn't want to keep making demands on them. So the answer is yes, they can access, they can comment if they want to, and it would be visible to you, but you might, if it was one of my anonymous participants commenting, you wouldn't necessarily be able to link that to, who the actual research participant was. So other challenges that you asked me about, one challenge about going open is that as soon as you announce that you're doing something openly, you become accountable to, you don't know exactly who, the world, right? Whoever might stumble upon your Twitter feed, you're suddenly accountable in a way that you weren't when you were doing it privately in your own, little study on your own desk. So I felt a much greater sense of commitment and responsibility for, not misquoting people or not drawing the wrong conclusion or getting the wrong end of the stick. If I didn't understand something, I really went back there, and that's why it's taken so long, and that's why I put in brackets as part of my title, kind of tongue-in-cheek, will I ever finish it? Because it has taken so much longer. And, I could have just, I didn't even have to do this. I could have just gone straight to, there's an online engagement framework, 5 categories, let's get on with it. But I have the privilege of being part-time at work, so I'm earning an income, and part-time able to focus on this. And it is a real privilege. I have a whole lot of privileges. I've written stuff about my positionality in chapter 1, which is available from the Google site. The whole fact I speak English as a mother tongue. I didn't have to learn a new language to engage in all this stuff. There's so much that I feel gives me not only a responsibility, but an obligation to share stuff. So yeah, it's added an extra, shall I say, burden of responsibility, but at the same time, it's so rewarding having these kinds of conversations that I wouldn't otherwise be having. And I'm not just doing this PhD to tick a box and put a title on my name, I'm doing it for a much deeper reason than that. So challenges, yeah, but challenges that I'm happy to deal with. Publishing implications quickly. I try, whenever I publish, to publish open access in open access journals that I don't have to pay a fee for, because I wouldn't be able to. So, and I have the privilege, again, it's not part of my career progression that I have to publish in certain very high status journals, so I can completely bypass that. And yeah, I see questions. I'll come back to the question about the supervisor that Melanie's asking. Fenella's asking a question that's relevant to this question of yours, Faith. Has there been a risk of your work being stolen? Well, the thing about publishing openly and blogging on the day that you have the thought, or I don't know, in my case, it's usually like 6 weeks after I had the thought by the time I've written the, that long blog post. It's date and time stamped to me. It's got my name on it. If anybody else takes copies that, they're welcome to. I've given them permission. That's what the Creative Commons license is. I'm saying, here it is. You don't have to write me an email and ask for my permission, but I've put some constraints on it. I've said you can't use this commercially. I don't want anyone taking my stuff and selling it on Amazon or anywhere else. Not at this stage. In a different context, I wouldn't mind, but this is my thesis and my PhD depends on it. And they have to attribute me. That's the fundamental of every single Creative Commons license, unless you go for a public domain license. But it's always CC BY, and the BY means they have to put your name. So if they don't, they're breaking the terms of the copyright. I still own copyright over it. I haven't given my copyright away. And exactly the same, all the same issues apply as if somebody were to take stuff from a book that has, a C and that big, all rights reserved. All the same rules apply if they don't follow those two small rules I've asked for. Should I just muff it? Should I launch into trying to answer questions?
Questions in the chat box. If you'd want to address that. The first one was from Melanie. She was asking what role do supervisors play in your approach, and then the Fenella one you just addressed it, and then there's Carmen who's asking about the involvement of research participants in your open thesis, and if you have perhaps she used a similar open access method with one of her project, but the issue of engagement and participation was a challenge. She's asking if you have perhaps experienced this and how could we improve active voices participation on an open online document research report.
Okay, so I'll start with Melanie's question. What role? I have one supervisor, and that's Dr. Kyung-Mi Lee, who some of you might have come across her work from Lancaster. She's written a lot about distance learning, and our shared research interest is how online and distance learning can be used to enable greater participation in higher education. She's been very encouraging, and she's been, I don't think from her own background, I don't think she would have suggested to me to do this openly. It's not a typical thing that PhD students do, not yet, it might become in the future. But she was, as long as I went through the proper approval processes and everything, which I did, I had to do that through 2 universities, both Lancaster and Leicester, because all my students are students at Leicester University, and I was doing this at the invitation of the director of that program. So I filled in 2 very lengthy ethical approval forms. Some of that stuff I've made available on the Google site, if anyone's interested in that. And I was actually surprised at the ethical approval process that I thought I was raising red flags all over the place. Hey, I'm doing this openly. Hey, I'm going to ask people if they want to be named. And the only feedback I got was from one of the universities that said I had to put a particular footnote into one of the consent forms about the legalities of data protection. And I did that, and it was approved. So I think that, there is an argument to be said for the fact that they are, they're not classified as vulnerable people, in that I could kind of pull the wool over their eyes or manipulate them. They're people who can make reasoned decisions, and they're adults. So sorry, I've gone a bit off track there, but I hope I've answered the question. To come on to Carmen's question, that is really an important one, and I so wish I could answer it with some helpful suggestions. in my own case, my experience has just been that I've been so grateful to the people who've given up their time to talk to me, and then again given up more time to read what I've written, on the basis of talking to them. And I'm still hoping they'll give up more time in the months to come when I start analysing their data. And because people started sharing personal stuff with me, we developed relationships, as you do. And there's, some of them I speak to quite regularly, every couple of weekends. Because that's the other thing, I offered to give all my research participants, and actually all the SARChI scholars in this program, whether or not they signed up as research participants, I offered to give them academic sort of study buddy support, in the sense that if they wanted feedback on an assignment outline or help trying to find literature for a particular topic or something, I would help them with that. So there are one or two who've taken me up on that quite regularly, and others who come back to me when there's something's gone wrong and they want some extra feedback on helping them interpret feedback they've got from the institution. So in those conversations, I've got to learn that a lot of people's lives are very complicated and very they have demands on their own personal time and energies that are way beyond my thesis, and so some of them I haven't gone back to just because I know that. But I might when their circumstances change, So Carmen, I can't really say. I think unless you made it your research project part of something where you were working with a group of students who were signed up for a particular course and it was made part of that course or something, then maybe there'd be a greater, a real legitimate incentive for them. The incentive for my research participants, I think, is clear to them. They all see it, that they are helping, all of them without exception want to make a difference to the entire refugee community and their own. Lots of them want to go back to their home countries and help rebuild them. So they see contributing to my research as playing a small part in that, but it really is a very small part in a much bigger whole.
Thank you for that, Gabi. I hope the questions were answered. And then there's another question from Fenella. How many SARChI students are there? How many were interested to participate in the study? And then the last is on the selection of participants. How did you select the 9 participants? And also Betha has questions. Why did you decide to have refugees from different places? Was it or not challenging to get these refugees? Perhaps you'd want to address these 2 questions.
Good questions. So I don't actually know how many SARChI scholars there are at the moment. They've been taking intakes of 6 at a time, roughly twice a year since the end of 2018, I think. So in the early days when I was trying to recruit research participants, I worked through the director of the program and the admin office there. To send out emails to all of them, and I was hoping they would all say yes, which would have given me a lot more work, but would have given more, rich data. But these are the ones who said yes. So it was a self-selecting group, and I was very grateful that I got that number, because that makes it, that makes it viable. If I'd only got 3 or 4, I think I would have had to change the nature of my study a bit. And then Bertha's question, why did I didn't actually decide to have refugees from different places. What happened for me was I got invited, like a gatekeeper opened a gate for me into this program that had access to these particular refugees and asylum seekers. And actually that made it very interesting for me, because the whole idea of online learning, and I'm interested in from an institutional point of view and pedagogy and curriculum and all those things, you're offering a distance program and you're trying to imagine this target audience. And do you think of that guy in the refugee camp in Malawi who's only access to reliable broadband and a computer is through his volunteer activities in a, you know, in a local sort of church center. So it's like saying, so where this is taking me, actually, maybe I'll just end with this, because it's been, for me, I've been trying to anticipate where this might go to once I start combining this with the online engagement stuff. And I've started already doing workshops with academics, because that's what I do in my day job, and asking them to think, okay, think about all the different ways you can engage your learners, and then stop and ask yourself, what are the freedoms, what are the assumed freedoms that you are making in each of these activities? And what if your students don't have those freedoms? So I'm calling those unfreedoms. And when you ask people that, they come up with lists and lists of stuff, you know, assumed freedom. Let's say we're doing an online exercise where everybody has to type something. Padlet, I don't know if you're familiar with Padlet. It's one of those online tools where you have little sticky notes and everybody types on them. Well, what are the freedoms you're assuming when people do that? The first and most obvious one is visual ability, you know, that they're fully sighted. And then you start to think, well, what about their devices, and what about their home environment, and what about this, and what about that? And as soon as you ask those questions, you have to think, well, okay, we can do that, but I must give people options, and we must give people different ways to engage to achieve the same goal. So I'm guessing that might be part of where this goes, but it might go somewhere else entirely as well.
All right, thank you for that, Gabi. We've got 4 minutes left. Maybe we can take one last question, and then we can round up. Do we have any questions? By the look of it, there are no more questions.
Maybe Faith wants to.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in how you filter the suggestions that come your way. So say, for example, a lot of people come to your the Google Doc and make suggestions. How do you decide this is what I'm taking, this is what I'm leaving?
Faith, that would be a wonderful problem to have, and I haven't had that problem yet, so I invite you all. I know there's only one document out on the Google Doc at the moment, but actually I'm almost finished the series on the capabilities, and I'm planning then to make that available in different formats. One will be a single PDF, like a little booklet that people can print off with a single reference list at the end, and just like sort of chapters or sections, and I'll put all the hyperlinks as footnotes so that anybody who can't access it online can then access it in a PDF. And if you like, I can stick that into a Google Doc. Yeah, I can easily do that. And I can make that for people to comment, and then you guys can all come and comment on it. And then as I add more stuff that will actually go into my chapters, you can comment. It will be ongoing for a good few months still. So I won't even talk about the time frame yet. It's too hard to predict. But I hope that September, October, I'll be analysing the data I've got from my students and starting to share some of my initial findings around about November.
Thank you very much, Gabi, for the insightful presentation. Your project is quite interesting and exciting. It will be of interest to find out what you would gather after your data collection. For those who would want to engage more with Gabi, you can stay online, and for those with questions, you can then send them direct to Gabi about her project.
Can I just ask, can I make one request, Moffat, before everyone disappears?
Okay.
Could we take a screenshot of anybody who's willing to put their video cameras on, and it will go into a blog post, because I'd like to write a blog post about this event. Would that be, would people be willing to do that?
Sure.
Sure.
Okay, do
Oh,
that.
great. I'm seeing cameras come on. That is wonderful. And I can only see a few people. I can't see everybody. So if anybody else is able to take screenshots.
For some of us who are quite dark, I think you'll have to put on filters and all that.
Okay, I got one. I got one that doesn't have everybody in it. Let me save that, and then I'll do another one. No, I get 9 people plus myself, so that's wonderful and very much appreciated. Thank you all so much, and definitely, please, anyone who wants to continue the conversation, I'm happy to stay here now, and you can find me on Twitter, you know where I am in my blog, you've got my email address, and I will continue joining in your brown bag sessions for as long as I'm invited, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabi. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Gabi.
Those who want to stay online, you can stay online, and then you can engage with Gabi directly.
And thanks,
Gabi. Yeah, I'll follow you, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about how your work progresses. It's really interesting, and all the best. Yeah.
Thanks, Nika. Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Gabi. I think I'll also follow you on Twitter.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I'll find you. I might be following you. I'll find you, Bertha.
Right. Thanks, and all the best.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
It sounds like there's going to be a lot of following to do.
Yeah.
That's great.
Follow each other.
Following is good.